Formula 1 will hold the first of its long-awaited sprint race weekends at the British Grand Prix. Qualifying takes place on Friday evening, with a 100km race, or the sprint as it's branded, on Saturday afternoon, setting the grid for Sunday's main race. This is the first time F1 has ever held any form of qualifying race during a World Championship race weekend. It's also only the second time there has been more than one race on an F1 weekend since the 1959 German Grand Prix at Aarhus was held over 2 heats. So if you want to know exactly how the new look weekend will work, from the big picture down to the tiniest detail, we've got you covered. And make sure you let us know in the comments what you think about the formats and how F1 could have improved it. The British Grand Prix will run to the usual 3-day format, but with some significant differences. Friday's running starts late, given the desire to give the 1-hour qualifying session an evening slot to suit the television audience. This follows a 1-hour free practice session. The timings for Saturday and Sunday are more conventional, opening with a 1-hour free practice session at midday, followed by the 100km sprint race, referred to in the sporting regulations as the sprint qualifying session, at 4:30 on Saturday. Sunday's Grand Prix starts at 3 p.m. The choice of starting tyre for the sprint is free, so the drivers can select whichever compound they prefer. The Q2 starting tyre rule is entirely removed, as the choice for the Grand Prix proper is also free. The drivers have a similar tyre allocation to the usual one, although they have only 12 rather than 13 sets of slicks, with an extra set of intermediates available. The slick selection comprises 2 hards, 4 mediums and 6 softs, meaning 1 more medium and 2 less softs compared to a standard weekend. On top of the 4 available sets of intermediates, a 5th can be made available if it rains on Friday or is expected to on Saturday. The regulations also state that only softs may be used during Friday's qualifying session. The medium compound is likely to be the popular choice for the sprint, given the race duration, although this could change depending on the conditions. The sprint race will last 17 laps at Silverstone. Pit stops are permitted, but they are not mandatory because there is no obligation to use 2 different compounds during the race. However, that regulation does remain in place for Sunday's Grand Prix. But while pit stops are allowed, they do not make strategic sense given the race length is insufficient to make up for the time loss. However, if there's a safety car, it is possible that some might make a pit stop to seek a competitive advantage, particularly those down the order. There is no limit to the quantity of fuel used during the sprint race, meaning cars can be loaded up with as much as the teams want for the start. However, the usual fuel flow limit of 140 kg per hour is in place. For Sunday's Grand Prix, the usual 110 kg fuel limit will be used. The top 3 finishers will be awarded both Drivers' and Constructors' Championship points. The winner will get 3 points, second place will get 2, and third place 1. F1 wanted to award points even further down the order to ensure the race did not become a procession, with drivers holding position to avoid compromising their Sunday chances. But there was a legitimate concern of taking too much emphasis away from Sunday's Grand Prix by making Saturday so valuable. In the case of a red flag, the sprint race can restart. However, it must be completed within 90 minutes of it starting, including any time under the red flag. The maximum total racing time is 1 hour. The cars enter PARC firm conditions when they leave the pits at the start of Q1 on Friday and remain there for the rest of the weekend. This means the suspension and aerodynamic configurations cannot be changed, save for front wing adjustments. This also means that setup changes cannot be made before or after Saturday's second free practice session. Component damage and wear is treated in the same way as on a normal Grand Prix weekend. Specified items can be changed freely as usual, with the capacity for teams to request permission to replace any other parts with ones of the same specification. In addition to this, on sprint qualifying weekends, teams may change the brake discs and caliper pads, the engine exhaust system, engine oil filters, intake air filter and spark plugs. However, in exceptional circumstances, teams will be permitted to use components of a different design, provided they are of a specification that has previously been used in qualifying or a race. This is to allay fears that there could be a shortage of parts. All grid penalties relating to gearbox changes, exceeding power unit component allowances, arising from gaining 3 reprimands or tyre misuse are applied to Sunday's Grand Prix only. However, other grid penalties could hypothetically be applied in the sprint, depending on how stewards word the penalty. Ahead of the British Grand Prix weekend, nobody has a grid penalty hanging over them. The finishing order of the sprint will decide the grid, with the winner officially being recognised as having taken pole position for the purposes of the history books. The drivers that do not complete the required 90% of the sprint race distance will be lined up behind the classified finishers based on laps completed. If any non-finishers complete the same number of laps, the order will be decided by the starting grid order for the sprint. Given the potential for a driver ruining their chances for the Grand Prix if they make a mistake during the sprint, there are concerns it could lead to drivers being conservative. After all, while a bold overtaking move in the Grand Prix itself will gain you a position, a gain in the sprint will only move you up one place on the grid. That has a value, but not if it could also put you well down the starting order if things go wrong. That's why Lewis Hamilton recently suggested he expected the sprint to be a procession. F1 Managing Director of Motorsport Ross Brawn has argued against this interpretation, insisting the drivers will always want to attack in races and that the short, sharp format will produce plenty of action. But while there's certainly a big incentive for those down the grid, or on those who underachieve in qualifying on Friday, to go on the attack in the sprint, history tells us that those at the front won't go for the minor reward of a small grid position gain if it's a huge risk. One of the major stumbling blocks when seeking agreement for the sprint race format to be introduced was the teams pushing for an extra allowance under the budget cap. This is because of the cost of the extra racing miles and resulting wear and tear, not to mention the risk of accident damage. To cover this, teams have been granted an extra $500,000 to cover the 3 sprint races this season. On top of that, there is also a mechanism to apply for an increase on that allowance in the cost cap in the case of significant accident damage. The Italian Grand Prix will use the new format, and there will be a third event that's yet to be confirmed. It is likely to be around the time of the United States Grand Prix, as F1 does not want the points available in the sprint race to be a potential title decider, so will avoid using the format in Saudi Arabia or Abu Dhabi at the end of the season. If the format is deemed a success, the likelihood is F1 will push for it to be used more in 2022. It will not become a permanent format, but Ross Brawn has personally targeted around 6 events next year. That will be subject to the teams voting for it, as the proposal will have to go through the full regulatory process again to be added to the 2022 rules. F1 will judge its success based on various factors including fan response, increased television figures, ticket sales, social media engagement, response from race promoters, and many more. The sprint format grew out of a proposal to run with a reverse grid, which Brawn has admitted was a step too far. F1 seems committed to the more conservative format being used at Silverstone as the right way to go, given the backlash from teams and fans when reverse grids were discussed. But while the reverse grids idea has been canned, Brawn remains open to trialling other experimental formats in the future. But he has also stressed that the sprint format won't be persevered with if it doesn't prove successful. Make sure you let us know what you think about F1's sprint race experiment in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, please do hit like and subscribe, and chime the notifications bell if you don't want to miss anything from the race.